If you have your own creepy story, I'm waiting for your email. All the information under the video. Thank you for watching. Please, press like and subscribe to my channel. The box had the power to bring people back from the dead, and it had made my dad very rich. This is going to be yours one day, so you need to listen and pay attention to everything I say and do. The box was a plain maple box with no markings, but it had a smell which was hard to describe. It smelled like something from my childhood, sweet, like cotton candy or freshly made waffles. The clients were siblings who never got to be by their father's bedside when he passed. They lived overseas and it was too late by the time they made it back. All they wanted to do was say goodbye to him one more time, and they were willing to pay a lot to do it. For the box to work, my dad would place a recent photo, the clothes the deceased were wearing when they died, and a precious personal item into the box. We brought what you asked us to bring. They handed my father a picture of the siblings and their father, which was taken the last time they were all together before he died. They then handed him a gold watch, which they said he had since he was a young man, and never took off his hand. My dad placed the items in the box along with what he was wearing the day he died. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I could feel the beating of my heart as we stood there waiting in silence. Suddenly a tapping sound could be heard coming from the box. It knocked 3 times before my father opened the lid. The old man looked confused at first, but when he saw the smiling faces of his kids, his eyes lit up. They spent the next 2 hours alone in a room together. I watched as my dad kept a close eye on my watch. "Why do they only get 2 hours?" I asked. "It's the rules, son," my father said abruptly. My father ushered the brother and sister of the dead man from the room. They looked devastated having to say goodbye, but at least they got to finally say it. My first experience with the dead was a strange moment for me. It was terrifying, but also kind of sweet. It was seeing the faces of the grieving families light up as they got to hug their dearly departed one more time. When it comes to the death of a child, parents would empty their bank accounts for a chance to hug their child one last time. The grief-stricken couple had traveled from the other side of the world. The pain of losing their child from a freak accident was etched into their faces. "Did you bring what I asked you to?" my dad softly asked. "This was his favorite toy. He never went anywhere without it," explained the woman. My dad placed all the items in the box before ushering the couple into another. Everyone waited with nervous apprehension. Suddenly, the smell of warm memories filled the room as the box started to shake. My dad walked over and took the lid of the box, and a fresh-faced, blonde-haired boy was smiling up at us. His blue eyes were bright and radiant, and he smelled like a newborn baby. "Mommy, Daddy," beamed the young boy as his parents embraced him. My dad kept a close eye on his watch as we sat in the next room. "I hate this part," said my dad with a sullen look on his face. When we entered the room, the smell of a newborn baby was replaced by the stench of rotten meat. The boy's radiant blue eyes were now black as coal, and his face deathly pale. "We explained the rules, Mrs. Jefferson. It's time," my dad said, as he quickly ushered the boy's crying parents from the room. My dad left me alone in the room with the boy. I watched in horror as the boy screamed in immense pain as his bones contorted and snapped. I remembered the boy's parents telling us he died from multiple fractures when a bookcase in the family home fell on him. The boy's face contorted in agony as he began to crawl unnaturally towards me. My body went stiff with fear as his hands pulled on the end of my jeans. All I wanted to do was scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Suddenly, my dad ran into the room and pulled the dead boy off me. The whole process didn't sit right with me. Watching that poor boy squirm in agony was a sight I never wanted to see again. After the parents had left, my dad picked up the boy as he cried for his parents and carried him from the room. "What are you going to do with him?" I asked. My dad stood silent as a look of guilt radiated from his eyes. "They're dead, son. Why does it matter?" As we stopped at a large steel door, my dad turned to me with a serious expression on his face. "You have to promise one thing. When I die someday, you will never bring me back." Something didn't sit right about the whole process, and I was starting to think my dad wasn't the good person I always thought him to be. A sense of dread crept up my spine as the smell of death hit me. He handed me the keys to the door, as the dead boy in his arms continued to wail in agony. My hands were shaking with fear as I placed the key in the lock. I slowly opened the door, and the sound of agonizing screams was deafening. The room was filled with hundreds of moaning and wailing corpses, some calling out for their loved ones. "It doesn't feel right to just bury them," he said, as he flung the dead boy like discarded rubbish into the pile of the living dead. "So, I've lived in the same town all my life. I've never really been one of those people that wants to see the world. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not my jam. I'm very content with my simple little life in a town of only about 6,000 people. The internet, more specifically Wi-Fi accessibility, hadn't quite reached us until a decade or so ago, and even then most were too poor to afford any kind of setup. Now, we're not backwards, incest-ridden savages or anything. I assume mostly everyone who's still here is pretty much like me, just happy with their small life, like Mrs. Weller. She's a widow just down the road from where I live, and she's well known for taking in animals that need a second chance. She's got the acreage and know-how, as she's the only one around here that we could call a vet. Actually, she's the reason I'm writing this today. I've recently realized that some of the things that go on around here aren't exactly normal. You live somewhere long enough, and even if the status quo for us wasn't at all similar to how others live, we wouldn't really know. The closest town is separated from us by miles and miles of farmland, about a 45-minute drive. But we've got the dollar store, a small grocery place, gas station, and post office. So, why would we ever have a reason to go poking around elsewhere, right? Despite having limited access to the internet at best, we all had a radio. We needed one, really. At least once a week we'd be informed about some kind of danger, I guess. To us, it was the same kind of warning as the typical, "There's been a crash on blah 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 highway, so plan your route accordingly." Anyway, sorry I got to rambling. I'll get on to the good part, I suppose. A couple nights ago, I had the radio on, just like my mama had always told me to do when the familiar sound of an incoming PSA roused me from sleep. See, we were taught to always keep some kind of radio going, whether it was in the truck, at the dinner table, or while we slept. The little box on the bedside table started to sing out the alarm we'd all come to be familiar with, not dissimilar to a tornado warning on TV. After about 10 seconds of this, the male announcer began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a PSA for county residents. Mrs. Weller has informed local police that a horse has chewed through the fence and escaped. Please, if you see this animal, stay far away and call 911 to report your sighting. If you begin to hear voices or have thoughts that are not your own, turn away and run. If you begin to feel faint or nauseous while looking at the animal, turn away and run. If the animal makes eye contact with you or begins to walk in your direction, turn away and run. If you cannot see any horse-like animal, but begin to feel a heavy pressure on your chest, enter your vehicle or run home as quickly as possible. If you are inside your home at this moment, remain there until an update has been broadcasted notifying the capture of this animal. Lastly, remember that horses do not speak." Now, I hadn't been too worried about the announcement at the time since I was already in bed. Even though it's a small town, most of us usually lock our doors at night anyway. I regarded it the same way I do just about every time the PSA tones come across the radio. I made a mental note to keep an ear out for the all okay broadcast and drifted back to sleep, only a little bit concerned with the dull pain growing in my chest. I woke just fine in the morning. When I sat at the kitchen table, a thought started creeping up on me. I'd been so tired when the PSA called out last night, but as the grumble of the coffee maker softly filled the silence, I really took a moment to analyze the words. Well, of course horses don't speak. Everyone knows that, I thought. Even though our town, probably even our county, was indefinitely weird, I'd be confident in saying that all the residents are firmly rooted to reality. We know the announcements are strange, but after generations of tribal knowledge, they kinda just fell into the background. Come to think of it, I really couldn't remember hearing about anyone around here leaving for a different life. I filled my cup, deciding that I'd run by the Gas and Munch for an egg sandwich so I could sit and talk with the other farmers while I finished breakfast. I got into the truck. The door latch is a little sticky, so I had to slam it loudly a few times before it shut. The sky was still dark, and the air was chilly and humid in the morning hours. I kept my handheld radio on the center console, as the radio in this old truck had stopped chugging years ago, when that family of three-headed squirrels made a nest in my wiring harness that I was never able to fully fix. Not the only time I had to deal with those crafty little things either. Last winter, they'd nested up in the attic with insulation and old... Fuck, I said to the dark truck cab as I slammed on the brakes. The horse. God, I completely forgot. There had been no accompanying broadcast announcing the capture of the horse. A small pang of fear settled in my chest, not quite blooming into full-on panic yet, as I started the 5-point turn it would take to turn around on the 2-lane I'd been on. This control was short-lived, though. Just as my truck became completely perpendicular with the road, my headlights illuminated the last thing I wanted to see standing in the half-grown soybean field in front of me. It definitely did not look like a horse. The neck was about twice as long as it should have been. Shredded and necrotic flesh clung to its emaciated form. The mane was frizzy and rat-nested. But the worst part was the sheer size of the thing. My best guess for breed was thoroughbred, but the damn thing still stood around 21 hands tall just at the shoulders. For those who don't know, 21 hands is about 7 feet tall. I'd like to say I kept my cool. That years of living in what's most likely the weirdest place ever has hardened me into a farm boy tough enough to scoff at unnatural horrors like this one. But I totally didn't. No. I slammed the gas and spun the tires fast enough to complete my U-turn and only skip into the ditch for about a foot or two. For only a moment I had hope that the horse would just keep being creepy in its creepy little spot on the side of this creepy little road. But of course it didn't. As soon as the truck started moving again, the horse began to run towards me. I felt the truck shake as it leapt into the bed and started pounding its rotting hooves on the top of the cab. My frantic mind only had one idea as I backtracked down the road. After all, Mrs. Weller was only a few miles down from me. I turned on the unpaved road, wheels spinning and sliding on loose gravel as I continued pushing the pedal so hard I was worried it'd break through the rusty floor panels. I could hear crunching glass as the horse nipped on my back windows. Voices screamed in my head all the while. You should drive into the ditch. Look, there's a telephone pole. Take your chance. I did my best to tune it all out, but the exaggerated thudding in my chest was accentuated by an immense pressure. It felt like someone was stacking bricks on my chest. I turned down the next road, and now it was a straight shot to Mrs. Weller's farm. Suddenly, the ear-splitting sounds of tearing metal and shattering glass faded away. In the moment, fear blinded my senses. Muscle memory was the only thing guiding me towards my destination. The lights at the end of her driveway flickered and fought with my headlights. Still hauling ass, I slid the corner into Mrs. Weller's driveway, and the truck lifted a couple inches with the release of weight off of the suspension. Just out of the corner of my eye, I saw the brown flash of an impossibly large, impossibly fast horse running towards the back pasture. I took a breath and steadied myself to back out onto the road when the radio crackled loudly to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a PSA for county residents. Mrs. Weller's horse has been returned to her property, and it is now safe to leave your homes. We hope you have a good day. God bless. I jumped at a sudden tap on the glass to my left. Sweet Mrs. Weller stood with a grateful smile and a steaming cup of coffee, to replace what had spilled out of my travel mug, which was now rolling around on the passenger floorboards of the truck. I know this town is weird, and maybe even horrifying, but at the end of the day, I knew my neighbors would be around to lend a helping hand when needed. I drove back down the road, on my way to a warm egg sandwich with a travel mug full of steaming coffee, still feeling content with my simple little life. There used to be a church in the woods. Sometimes there still is. I work for a nonprofit in a fairly large city in the New England area. Think bigger than most Midwestern cities, but nowhere near as big as NYC. I'm trying to keep this as vague as possible without leaving out important details, as I do love my job, and I would hate for this to impact it somehow. That being said, very recent events have made it difficult to stay silent, and I desperately need some advice on what to do next. So anyways, the nonprofit I work for specifically serves homeless and underprivileged boys and young men in our city. We offer food, shelter, showers, you name it. Anything to keep them off the streets, is what our founder has always said. He's been running things since the late 70s and simply refuses to retire. He spent most of his childhood homeless, so I guess he made it his personal mission to help as many youths as he could. I work on the admin side, so I don't actually see the ones we help out as much, but it's still very fulfilling work. Recently, my main focus has been on house hunting of all things. We've long since outgrown our current facilities in the city. With some creative thinking, we've been able to make it work longer than it probably should have. But now we're at the point where we've been forced to turn some kids away. We all hate it, most of all the owner. So we decided to find some room in the budget and put it towards finding a second location. My budget was pretty restrictive, especially considering how much space we needed. For this and a few other reasons, we decided to look in more of the rural areas outside of town. It takes a couple hours to get out of the urban sprawl, but after that it pretty abruptly falls off into forests and farmland. Growing up in the city myself, it honestly feels like driving on an alien planet, but I can't deny how peaceful it is. After a few months with absolutely zero listings in our price range, I finally found one that we could afford, and that wasn't too far away. It was a big ranch-style home on a few acres all to itself. It even had a barn that we could probably repurpose into additional lodging at some point. The price seemed almost too good to be true, but the house did need some serious work, just looking at the pictures, and I was sure even more would be found during an inspection. Me and a few other members of the admin team drove out that same day to take a look. The realtor selling the place was your textbook small-town celebrity. As we met with him, he greeted every other person by name as they passed by on the street. And when we asked about the work needing to be done on the house, he rattled off a list of a dozen contractors in the area that he knew personally. He had a big smile and a way of talking that made me feel like we had already bought the place. The realtor told us the history of the lot, how it had been owned by a prominent local family for generations. Multiple members of the family had served as mayors or judges in town going back over 200 years. The family even had a small church built on the property back in the early 1800s, the only church in town for quite a while. Unfortunately, it had been demolished back in the 1930s. He said the foundation is still out in the wooded area of the lot somewhere, though it's pretty much entirely grown over with grass and other foliage now. I asked why the family had decided to sell the place after so long, and he told us how the only remaining descendants had passed away recently with no apparent heirs, and they willed it and everything else they had to the town. There was some push from the locals to turn it into a museum, but the city council didn't figure they really had the tourism draw to keep such a thing going. The realtor said he was surprised to hear back on the listing so quickly since everyone seems to be moving to the city, not so much the other way round. We asked a few more questions and pretended to take the night to mull it over, but we were already sold. Even after the inspections and all the estimates, it still came in just under budget. It needed a lot of work for sure, but it had that rustic charm. Or maybe the realtor was just really good at selling things. The other admins were already drawing up plans of how everything would be situated and the best ways to utilize the space. We called him back first thing in the morning. We closed on it just over a month ago. Since then, I've mainly been in charge of going out there and meeting with and checking on contractors as we get the place fixed up. The goal is to have it ready before the holiday season, as that always tends to be a busy time of year for us. Things have been progressing smoothly aside from a few hiccups here or there. I normally go up every few days for an hour or two. Last weekend I drove up as usual on Friday to take a look. We have electrical and plumbing fully finished now, and after some work on the north-facing wall that was just completed, it was mostly rotted out. The home is now officially inhabitable. It still needs new flooring in most of the house, a new AC and furnace, new hot water heater, new light fixtures, etc., but just being able to live in it felt like a pretty significant milestone. I had a busy morning, so I got there a little later than usual this time, and within the hour the workers had packed up and left for the day. I knew if I left, then I would just be sitting in rush hour traffic for hours, so I figured this would be the perfect time to get some updated pictures to send the rest of the team. So I spent the next hour or so walking around and snapping pics of the progress. After I finished up, the sun had started to set, so I decided to head out. That is until I realized that I must have driven over a rogue nail on my way into the driveway. My front left tire was completely flat. Lovely. And of course that tire was already the spare. That's on me, I guess. But I will say that the work I do doesn't exactly afford me a ton of extra cash each month. For this same reason, I was also hesitant to call somebody out to tow me who knows how far to the nearest tire shop that was still open. And so I made the decision to test out just how inhabitable the place really was. I had some old blankets in the trunk and an extra phone charger. It would be kind of like camping, I thought, or at least as close as a city boy like me had ever experienced. I called the others at work and let them know, half hoping one of them would offer to drive out and pick me up. No luck. While I still had some light, I walked back down the winding driveway to close the main gate by the road. Then I brought the blankets in from the car and set up a small sleeping area in the living room. All in all, it was comfortable enough. It was a bit drafty, and the place creaked and moaned like any old house. I also found the moonlight peeking through the thick forests a little unsettling. The way the trees moved in the wind made my mind play tricks on itself, seeing figures in the tree trunks and movement in the branches. I wished we had curtains I could pull shut to stop the shadows from dancing across the floor all around me. I walked around the house to make sure everything was shut up and locked before I crawled into my homemade floor mattress and tried to go to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up abruptly. It felt like that telltale sensation of falling that jolts you from a dream, though I didn't remember dreaming anything just prior. It took a minute for me to calm myself back down, and I decided I might as well get some water before I went back to sleep. As I stood up, I glanced out the window and went still. There was light coming out from the woods. Not moonlight, warm yellow light, flickering through the thick bramble of trees. My first thought was some sort of forest fire. My heart dropped as my mind went to the worst-case scenario. I pictured the place going up in smoke so close to it being finished. We'd be back to square one. I pulled my shoes on quickly and grabbed my phone as I headed out the back door. I wasn't excited about trudging through the woods in the middle of the night, but I needed to confirm if there was a fire so I could call someone as soon as possible. Trudging was definitely the right word. I had to lift my knees high to step through the thick underbrush as small branches smacked me in the face and cut into my arms. I had my phone flashlight on, but it didn't help much with the leaves being as thick as they were. After a few minutes, I had almost decided to head back and just call the fire department to be safe. But just then, I saw what looked like the edge of a clearing, where the yellow flickering light was much brighter. I pushed forward a little more and broke through the tree line. What I saw confused me more than anything. No forest fire, lanterns, small handheld oil lanterns, and they were being carried by a line of people walking calmly down a worn dirt path through the woods. They were only maybe 20 feet away, at least 50 of them. There were men, women, and children, and they all wore simple black and white clothes that looked like something out of the Crucible. I stood dumbfounded and realized that I must still be asleep. But I couldn't wake up. I bit my lip and closed my eyes, but the procession remained when I opened them. The end of the line was just about to pass me. I yelled at them. I don't remember what I said, not that it mattered much, because they didn't react at all. They just kept walking. So I followed them. What else was I supposed to do? As I fell in behind the last of them, I realized it was what seemed to be a small family. A young man and woman with a small boy in tow. The woman was crying. I tried to reach out to one of them, but my hand always seemed just too far away, like some sort of optical illusion. I shouted again, and again got no feedback whatsoever. As I continued following them, I saw some sort of structure at the end of the path. It was simply built and painted white. The roof rose up sharply on both sides to a steep point at the top. There were a set of double doors opening right onto the path, with a half-circle window sitting atop them. It looked like a church. I kept telling myself I should just run back to the house and pull the covers over my head, but I followed anyway. The people filed neatly into the church, which seemed to be lit with bright oil lanterns along the walls inside and flanking the door on the outside. As the congregation entered, they snuffed out their handheld lanterns and bowed to a man at the door. It took a few minutes to get to the front of the line, and the family in front of me also bowed. As they did, the man at the door, who until this point had remained statuesque, reached forward and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. He leaned close and said something to her. She nodded back, but didn't stop crying. I slipped inside behind them, and I felt a cool gust at my back as the doors closed. The family sat down in one of the pews which lined the main aisle. At the end of the aisle was a simple wooden podium standing on a raised platform. Beyond it was a small opening to another room or hallway. The man at the door walked past me down the aisle. The room was completely silent as all of the congregation sat with their heads bowed. As the man took his place behind the podium, he called out in a language I didn't understand. It sounded kind of like Latin. He spoke for a few moments, and then was met with a response from the group in unison. This went back and forth for a few minutes. Occasionally, a man who sat nearest the podium would ring a bell, and the people would all look upward for a few seconds, before returning their gaze to the ground. The man stepped out from behind the podium and held out his hands as he spoke once more. This time it sounded like a question. After a silence that seemed just a bit too long, a weak, faltering voice answered from the rear of the room. The mother stood up with her son and stepped into the aisle. As they did, the father took the son's hand and said something to him before reluctantly letting go. The mother kneeled down and embraced the young boy. She cried openly, but no one else moved or reacted at all. The boy himself looked unfazed. He wrenched himself from her grasp and started walking down the aisle. The woman collapsed on the floor, and only then did her husband move to help her back into the pew. The man at the podium smiled as the boy approached him, and all of the people in the church bowed and repeated something under their breath as he walked past their row. The man at the podium took the boy's hand and led him through the opening at the back. For a few minutes, no one moved or spoke. It felt like an eternity, finally broken only by the ringing of the bell once more, though this time it echoed from far away. In unison, everyone in the church stood again and began filing into the same opening. The tension wrapped tightly around my chest. I began running through the crowd towards the back of the church. As I passed by people, it seemed as though I partially moved through them somehow, and my whole body shivered. I reached the open doorway and found only a small room, not much bigger than a closet. But set into the ground was a large wooden hatch held open with a metal hook on the wall. Carved stone steps led down into an inky abyss. I remember thinking in that moment, if I go down there, I may never be the same. But I went down anyway, like a moth to a campfire. The steps led down deeper than I thought, and they ended in a large stone room. Some of the congregation was already here. They knelt on the cold, hard floor with their hands flat on the ground in front of them. As more entered, they assumed the same position. Beyond them, the only light in the room came from a small candelabra. It sat on a wide stone altar. The boy lay on the altar with his eyes closed and his arms crossed over his chest. The man from the podium stood behind him and chanted something as he held a small metal pitcher above his head. On the wall behind them was a taxidermied bullhead with great big horns. Only the bottom of it was lit by the candles, and even glancing at it made me feel an overwhelming sense of dread. I looked away just in time to see the last of the group entering and kneeling down. It was the mother and father. They both moved as if partially comatose, almost trance-like. The man at the altar spoke once more. This time there were no responses from the group. Every few sentences he would stop and pour something from the pitcher onto the child in front of him. It looked clear, but it was thicker than water. The boy didn't react, even as the man poured the liquid over his face. After this repeated a handful of times, he upended the pitcher entirely and emptied it. He then turned from the boy and faced the bull head mounted on the wall. He spoke once more, again sounding like a question, before he joined everyone else in kneeling on the ground with his hands forward. In a moment, all the air in the room seemed to evaporate. I couldn't breathe, and it sounded as if I was in a vacuum. My heart seemed to beat irregularly, and I nearly fell to the ground. And then I heard it. Or I felt it. Or I sensed it. I don't know. Something in the silence, a more intense pressure, like something pushing on my eardrums and my eyes at the same time. I tried to gasp as I felt my lungs flatten in my chest. I saw some of the people on the floor start to react similarly. And at the height of everything, I saw the candelabra tip over on its own and fall onto the altar. All at once, a cacophony of sight and sound erupted in the small room. The boy's body erupted in flames. People screamed, some in terror, though most in some sick sense of euphoria. The flames licked up onto the ceiling and spread along it, bathing the whole room in radiant heat. The boy's body convulsed and flailed. The man at the altar laughed as he danced around with glee, and the flames parted just enough to see the bull's head on the wall, fully illuminated in a dark red hue. For a split second, I swear I saw it move. My senses caught up to me, and I ran from the room faster than I've ever moved before. I flew up the stairs, taking 2 or 3 with each stride. The screaming and laughing did not die down behind me. As I reached the top of the steps, I was relieved to find the hatch still open, and even more relieved to see the front door to the church once again open at the far end of the aisle. I continued running, nearly tripping and falling around the podium in my mad scramble. I never looked back, even as I found myself once again on the dirt pathway. I just kept running, even when I no longer knew where I was or where I was going. The path eventually ended, and I found myself back in the thick mess of trees. They cut into me even sharper than before as I pushed through frantically. By some miracle, I happened to spy the house again through the leaves. I ran inside and locked the door. I crawled into my blankets and stayed there unmoving for some length of time. After a while, I worked up the courage to glance out the window again for just a second. No light in the woods. Nothing to see. I retreated to my safe space again. I didn't move until I saw sunlight through the threads of the sheets. That's where I am now, sitting on the floor in this empty house, wrapped in tattered old blankets. If I had fallen back asleep afterwards, I would have written it off as a nightmare. But I have the fresh cuts on my arms and legs, and still wet mud on my shoes to prove otherwise. I don't know how, but it was all real. More real than anything I've ever experienced. I don't know what to do. Should I call the police? I want to tell the others at work, but I know they'll just think I've lost it. Part of me thinks I should go back out and see if anything is still there. Get some pictures or something. But the thought of going back there makes me sick. There's something in the woods, and I think it's been there a long time. Don't forget subscribe and press like. Thank you for watching.